Що ви замаху не скидате. Готові? Є, готові. Чи? Бачите всіх, ні? Бачите всіх? Бачите всіх? Я? Ще раз більше назад. Хай полягай! Михайло!
Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the group shot taken on top of the mountain. There's a high gale blowing which is interfering considerably with the microphone sound. Sounds like thunder, distant and surrounding. Stop.
Would you take one of mine?
This is Channel 4. In place of our advertised programme Scales of Justice, we're now showing a Scottish television report entitled Britain, the Nazi Safe House.
The Cenotaph in London. It stands as a memorial to soldiers who died in the Second World War. Yet just 3 years after that war, Britain became a safe house for Nazis. Not only that, our government instructed other countries to protect them and to make them safe as well. We have secret documents which reveal that the plan worked. It was only when the Allies swept into Germany that the full horror of Nazi atrocities started to unfold. At the end of the war, the leaders of the Third Reich, the men who'd masterminded mass murder and torture, faced trial at Nuremberg. But we can reveal that even as those trials were taking place, Britain was already planning to end cases involving other war criminals. We've obtained secret documents sent by the British government to Commonwealth countries, which show that Britain was drawing up a policy which would effectively make this country a safe house for Nazi war criminals. This policy meant that many war criminals living in Britain escaped prosecution, like Dr. Vladislav Deering, who was a doctor at Auschwitz. Eventually, he was to go on and be awarded the OBE by Britain. Like Stanislaus Zvaric, who murdered babies in front of their mothers. Like Antonis Kikas, who it's alleged took part in the murder of 200 unarmed men, women and children.
He's been in touch with his lawyer.
The man who discovered that Gekas is alive and well and living in Edinburgh is top American Nazi war crimes prosecutor Eli Rosenbaum. He accuses successive British governments of providing sanctuary for Nazi war criminals through a secret policy agreed in 1948. That policy is all the more remarkable because only 5 years earlier, in 1943, the leaders of the Allied countries, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt, signed a treaty in Moscow agreeing that war criminals should be hunted down.
It was a declaration subscribed to by the three Allied leaders in order to establish the principle of the policy of what was then going to be the United Nations, that the war criminals of the Nazi Axis would be brought to face their crimes and taken back to the countries where these abominations are being committed, and they would be made to answer for them.
What was Churchill's attitude towards Nazi war criminals?
The United Kingdom, through its Foreign Office, had a list, as Churchill put it, of the 100 worst Nazis. And if any of these evil men fell into the hands of the United Kingdom government, they would be shot humanely and swiftly. But the indictment would be read to them first. In the early days, the revulsion of the public from what they'd seen in the film of the Belsen trial, which was shown fairly early on, I think, in Leicester Square, was obviously something that no government could ignore, and people demanded as swift as possible a trial of the people who'd run that particular hellhole. Later on, as the climate of opinion, political opinion, the winds changed in Europe, and we had approaching the Berlin airlift, the revival of Western Germany, and all the difficulties of the Cold War were approaching, a different approach was discernible in government policy. And there was a cooling of the enthusiasm of the government towards the trial of war criminals.
Oh, I think that the governments of the day felt that they'd had enough and were looking around for other enemies. I suspect that once the war with the Germans was won, there were some people who said, oh, well, who are the real enemies now? And they said, oh, it's the Russians, and so anybody who was anti-Russian is all right with us.
That is why the British government closed the file on war criminals. Politics had overruled public demands for justice. This document is still classified in Britain, but we've obtained it from Canadian sources. It's from Philip Noel Baker, Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations in 1948. It spells out the British government's view regarding war criminals in the UK zone of Germany.
In general, no fresh trials should be started after August 31st, 1948. This would particularly affect cases of alleged war criminals who might subsequently come into our hands. In our view, punishment of war criminals is more a matter of discouraging future generations than of meting out retribution to every guilty individual. It is now necessary to dispose of the past as soon as possible.
The British government didn't stop there. 3 months later, in another document, still secret, they wrote to Commonwealth countries urging them to stop Nazi hunting.
We are anxious that all extraditions arising out of the war should be brought to an end as soon as possible. All applications by foreign powers for extradition of persons alleged to have committed acts of treason or collaboration with the enemy during the period of occupation by the armed forces of Germany or her allies should be presented on or before 1st January 1949.
Now, not only Britain, but the Commonwealth had become a haven for war criminals.
I would be horrified if that were the case, but I'm sure that that's the sort of information, if it came to light, that the committee would be pursuing very, very actively.
I'm surprised that happened because whereas there must have been large numbers of people who were on the periphery, there must have been serious war criminals who still could have been pursued.
In Parliament 4 months ago, Greville Jenner and Merlin Rees were alarmed when new information from America alleged the existence of 17 war criminals in Britain. They set up a parliamentary war crimes group to investigate such cases.
In 1961, a request was made of the British government for the extradition of a man named Aoun Irvin Mere, M-E-R-E, an Estonian national who was wanted for the mass murder of some 125,000 human beings at the Yagala concentration camp and related subcamps in Nazi-occupied Estonia. The British authorities said no, there is no extradition treaty in this case that covers this man. Moreover, as they put it, an unduly long period of time has elapsed since the commission of the crimes. That was one case. I should note that later that year, Mayer was tried in absentia in the Soviet Union, was convicted, and was sentenced to death. He died living in peace in the United Kingdom years later, never, ever brought to justice.
So the secret 1948 plans had worked. Other documents we've discovered in America show how effectively they were implemented. One of the most notorious death doctors at Auschwitz was Dr. Vladislav Dering. He found sanctuary in both Scotland and England. Although he was wanted by the British government, they refused to do anything about him. And almost unbelievably, they awarded him the OBE.
A man who was involved in the most notorious sterilization, so-called experiments on men and women prisoners at the Auschwitz death camp during the war. A man who personally performed the surgery on these victims. We now have a newly discovered document, the recently declassified Central Registry of War Criminals, on which Dr. Dering's name appears, listed as wanted for torture. Under the column wanted by, there is a one-word entry, UK. In 1948, that is to say later the same year, his extradition was formally requested by Poland, on whose territory, of course, Auschwitz was located, and the British authorities said no.
He was a doctor, and he'd been captured, and he ended up in a concentration camp. He was released for doing an extremely unpleasant series of revolting operations called ovarectomy on young Jewish Salonika girls, aged the age group 16, 17, or 18, which is removal of ovaries by a local Novocaine injection in the spine. And ultimately, Dering, having done so well in this field, was released from the camp, and that was big news in the camp, in his striped suit, tailor-made, laced-up shoes with 2 heavy suitcases. That is not the normal way a prisoner left Auschwitz. He normally left it up the chimney.
When he came to Britain, where did he end up?
In Scotland, where he somehow or other, and this is all collected by fragments, took part in a Christmas mess party. It must have been the first Christmas of the end of the war, with some Scottish officers, Polish officers in Scotland. And Dering was a little addicted to the brandy, and he got rather tight at this Christmas party. They were Polish officers. And under the influence of drink, Dering pointed to the suit he was wearing and said, "Do you see this suit? It's an excellent suit, one of the best sort of woven materials in Europe. It belonged to a Dutch professor. He went up the chimney. Do you see my pipe wallet? It was a pouch. Do you see that? I got that from a prisoner. It's made out of a prisoner's scrotum."
They then employed the man as a doctor for the colonial service in Somalia, awarded him, of all things, the OBE, and then allowed him to move to London, where he set up a very lucrative medical practice, treating private patients, and he died in London in the 1960s, despite the fact that he had been exposed in 1963. The British government well knew who he was and took absolutely no action to disturb the quietude of his life.
The pressure to have war criminals living in Britain brought to justice has mostly come from Russia. But frequent pleas from Russians in the areas where the war crimes were committed have consistently been rejected by the British government on the grounds that there is no extradition treaty with Russia. At the Russian embassy in London, we heard of one case they've been pursuing since 1971. It involved a man called Zvarich, who lived in Bolton under a new name.
The people of Volyn region of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic sent a letter to British authorities asking for extradition of 2 war criminals, Zvarich and Sulima. They perpetrated crimes during the Second World War. They murdered children in the presence of their mothers. They burned down a house. One of them, Zvarich, for example, burned down a house with people having a wedding celebration. they used to bury people alive. And people in Ukraine have been saying about him since that time, a wild beast, not a man. So they perpetrated crimes against the humanity. And the people of Ukraine once again appealed to British authorities that these criminals were brought to justice.
What was the response to the letter?
The response was negative.
So time and again, when the presence in the UK of accused Nazi war criminals has been brought to the attention of the British authorities, they have declined to take any action whatsoever, and for many, many years have been saying, in the words of various British documents, an unduly long period of time has elapsed since the commission of the crimes. That very language was used in an October 1986 letter from Minister of State Tim Renton to Member of Parliament Greville Janner in the case of another individual living in Bolton, whom the UK authorities refused to extradite back in 1971 when his surrender to stand trial on war crimes charges was first demanded. So nothing, I'm saddened to say, has changed.
Britain's lack of interest in bringing war criminals to justice is reflected in Mr. Renton's letter last year. He said Zavaric could not be extradited. Had a simple check been made by Mr. Renton or the Foreign Office, they would have found, as we did, that Zavaric, under his new name Petrovsky, died in a Bolton hospital in 1984. He died without being investigated or brought to justice, so the 1948 plan had worked again. But an even more sinister scheme had been hatched by British and US intelligence in 1947. It's still top secret here, but we obtained a copy of it in Canada.
At the present time, there is residing in the British zone a Soviet citizen. His presence in the British zone is a source of embarrassment to British military government, as the Soviet authorities are continually asking for his return for trial as a war criminal. The British have asked me if it is possible for U.S. intelligence authorities to take him off their hands and see that he is sent to the U.S., where he can be lost. For my information, will you advise me as to what you may be able to do in this matter, or in similar cases which may arise in the future?
This man, who we are not allowed to identify, was smuggled to America on a route which became known as the Rat Line. His secret flight to America established that Britain was willing to assist suspected war criminals. When the Prime Minister went to the Holocaust Center in Israel in 1986 to pay homage to the millions of Jews murdered by the Nazis, she showed the public face of Britain's attitude to war criminals.
I think the photographs show it more vividly than any amount of words can say. It is so terrible. There's one picture there of a Nazi firing at a woman who was standing there with a child in her arms. Really, everyone should come and see it so that they never forget.
That's Britain's public face. The until now private policy has been less sympathetic. While she was there, the Wiesenthal Centre was drawing up a list of 17 alleged war criminals still living in Britain. The man they most want living in Edinburgh is Antonis Gikas.
Mr. Gekas is accused of mass murder. He lives in Edinburgh. He's a mining engineer, and we have the documentation.
Well, the Gekas case, as I've said in the House, I say this specifically for obvious reasons, he is alleged to be a very serious war criminal. He has made himself certain admissions, and he's certainly very high on the list of priorities of those whose case should be examined, and we're hoping the Prime Minister will refer to in her reply.
This is Jonas Plunga, a fellow officer of Gikas. Extraordinary film. He's testifying here at his own 1979 war crimes trial in Lithuania, confessing. This woman is obviously a witness to the crimes, and she's recalling what she saw. Here we have a captured Nazi war document. Jonas Plunga, who we just saw on trial, same document with Antonis Gikas, or as he used to be known, Getsevicius. There's a wartime Nazi newspaper, and here's your man, Antonis Gikas, in the uniform of the Third Reich, wearing the Iron Cross. Look at that, they've even got his address in Edinburgh, Antanas Gechis. We saw on this film the environs of Slutsk in Byelarussia as it looks today. This is the site of the most notorious massacre by Gekis's battalion. Primarily they were killing Jews, Jewish civilians. We're only talking here about civilians, unarmed people, people who had no means at all with which to defend themselves. The crimes were so bestial and so cruelly executed that they shocked even the SS, which complained to headquarters that the Lithuanians were responsible for quote-unquote acts of indescribable brutality. That comes from a captured Nazi document that was offered in evidence at the Nuremberg war crimes trials.
You signed a statement in front of Edinburgh Police to the effect that you witnessed the shooting of approximately 150 people.
Yes.
Did you take any part in that shooting?
Absolutely nil, because we were defending, Germans were doing good, and we don't know what they were shooting. They were, as I say, were coming through these villages, towns, forests, and the secret police and Gestapo and local police, they were asking this if this local or somewhere else or what, and then they were shooting, while we were on the duties outside, somewhere maybe mile, 2 miles outside the area.
By virtue of his helping the Germans to carry it out in terms of protecting the Germans from a rear area attack and preventing the victims from escaping by encircling the area of the executions, he participated directly in the crimes, even though he may not have pulled the trigger, although there is evidence that he was personally involved in shooting as well.
Were you aware that in protecting the Germans, that in fact you were helping them shoot and murder innocent people?
Yes, I was aware, but what we could do about it?
Were you
if we didn't do, they would shoot us.
Let's just look at what Antanas Gekis has admitted. Let me suggest an analogy. If you and I go to someone's house here in Glasgow to kill him, and we agree that you will do the actual killing, and that my job is to lock all the doors to the house and stand guard, so that if anyone comes, in particular the police, you will not be interfered with as you carry out this killing. You and I would be held by any court in Scotland to be equally complicit in this act of murder. It is, I have enabled you to carry out the crime and have prevented the victim from escaping. It's a standard tenet of Anglo-Saxon common law.
But you are aware that in protecting the Germans, that in fact you were allowing them to carry out the murder of innocent people?
But how we know? We didn't know these. That was a war. The shootings go inside when you start. They go into the, say, the forest or in a village. Start shootings. Now, you don't know what's happening.
There is no doubt at all in my mind. I don't think there was any doubt in the minds of my colleagues at the United States Department of Justice. And frankly, what shocked us was not just that Gekis was living here, but that our interview of him in 1982, which was, after all, conducted in the presence of a representative of the Lothian and Borders Police, did not, in fact, lead, apparently, to any kind of investigation, and certainly to any kind of action on the part of UK authorities.
Assuming that the evidence is that he was an active, consistent participant in the deliberate extermination of Jews in the former Baltic states by mass shootings, sometimes called Sonderaktion, and those allegations exist and evidence to support them, I see no reason whatsoever why this gentleman should have his crimes overlooked.
What fear would you have in being tried on these alleged crimes?
No, I have no fear whatsoever. I have no fear whatsoever. But there'll be no fair trial in Russia. That's out of question. There'll be just nothing else. You confess, you tell everything you tell, and everything they beat you up, and you do that, torture, and you'll tell whatever they want to tell. Not different in this country. In other countries, you could have witnesses, you could tell, and they take evidence. Not Russians.
Our trial of war criminals are open. If you need a testimony of the fairness of this trial, you can go and see yourself.
I would want to put him on trial. I would get the best lawyers available to me to say, where can he be put on trial? Can he be extradited? If he's become a British citizen, can his citizenship be taken away from him? I would want to not move on my emotions, but I would want my emotions to drive me to get the best information so that I could do something about it.
Since we began our investigation last year, we've made 78 phone calls to the Home Office, asking what was being done about the list of 17 alleged war criminals sent to them from America. We asked them and the Foreign Office for interviews. They both refused. Eventually, the Home Office issued a statement saying, "We have never received a request in respect of an alleged war criminal from a country with which we have an extradition treaty. There's no such treaty with the Soviet Union or Israel." Tonight, we have revealed that Britain drew up a secret plan to stop taking action against Nazi war criminals living in Britain just 3 years after the war. They instructed Commonwealth countries to do the same, and they even asked the Americans to lose people wanted for such crimes. They also repeatedly said that it all happened such a long time ago. They said that in 1948, in 1961, in 1972, and in 1986.
Well, I don't think that people would put that argument if, like myself, half their family had been murdered. In my case, brought together in a synagogue, and they set light to the synagogue and killed them all. There isn't any limitation period on murder anyway. The memory ought to be kept alive because this kind of inhumanity can recur. And I was a war crimes investigator in Germany, in the British Army, at the time when War Crimes Group was disbanded in 1949. And we knew that there were thousands of war criminals on the loose. And I've always thought that it was a very wicked world that would allow people like that to sleep in their beds at night in peace after the murders that they'd committed.
If the government in London does not hear from the people that this injustice must be righted, then I suspect that nothing will be done. And the British policy of non-interest, shall we say, in Nazi war crimes will be continued.
4 months ago, the Simon Wiesenthal Centre gave Mrs. Thatcher a list of 17 men living in Britain who they said should be investigated for alleged war crimes. But will she act? 16 haven't been identified. We've identified the most wanted, Antonis Gikas.
I've come 3,000 miles to see this man. Let's see him.
Hello, is Mr. Gikas in, please? It's Bob Tomlinson. I said I'd drop in today to see him. Thanks. Ooh. Can I introduce Eli? Eli is from America. He was investigating all the cases.
Sorry, I'm not listening, just...
I work for the U.S. Department of Justice, and I assure you, the U.S. Department of Justice is not the case.
Nothing to say, nothing to say.
There'll come a time when questions will be asked and answers will have to be given, you know. Time will come.
Taking pictures.
It's beautiful, do you know that? No, don't worry. Hey, bloody hell, Bowden, this is real. It's doing its own work. You're just coming around now. That's it, leave it as it stands.
Do it.
That is just exactly the way we want it. Just don't get in the way now.